right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're heading east to one of the most significant periods, I think, in Chinese history.
Oh, absolutely.
For the Ming Dynasty,
Yes.
we're talking 1368 to 1644,
That's a pretty good run.
nearly 3 centuries.
It is.
And what's really interesting about this period is it's often considered to be one of the greatest periods of orderly government and social stability in human history. Like, that's a pretty big claim.
Well, and it's really interesting too, because if you think about it, during this time, the population just exploded.
Yeah.
It went from about 60 million to somewhere between like 150 and 200 million,
Huge.
which kind of implies that things were going pretty well for a lot of people for a long time.
Yeah, it must have been pretty good if the population was booming like that.
Right, exactly.
So for you listening, for us, I think, to understand how this long-lasting dynasty came to be and the impact it had, we got to really get into it, right?
Yeah, for sure.
We have a ton of information. We're using the Wikipedia entry on the Ming Dynasty, pulling out the good stuff for you.
The juicy bits.
But really, what we're trying to do in this deep dive is unpack how the Ming Dynasty started, how it got so strong, then went through this golden age, but then ultimately collapsed. Like, how do we get from point A to point, Z in this really interesting period?
Yeah, totally. And to do that, I think we have to start with how things were before the Ming came to power.
Okay, before the Ming, so to set the stage for us.
So we're talking about the end of the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty, right? By the 14th century, they were having a really rough time.
Yeah, not looking so good for them, huh?
Not at all. There were all these natural disasters happening, like really severe droughts, massive floods, changing the landscape. And then on top of that, there were just swarms of locusts wiping out crops. And then, and this is, if things weren't bad enough, you also had what historians believe was the Black Death sweeping through.
Oh, wow. I mean, it's like one thing after another.
It was a terrible time. So you can imagine people are not happy. So you start to see all these rebellions popping up. And the big one, the one you really need to know about, is the Red Turbans.
Okay, the Red Turbans. And this is where our main man, Zhu Yuansang, comes in.
Exactly. Now, his story, this is a guy who started as a peasant, actually lost his parents when he was 16 in a Yellow River flood, and he became a monk. I mean, talk about a rags to riches story.
It's incredible. I mean, he's a monk, and he ends up founding a dynasty. Like, how does that even happen?
Right. But, you're going to see he was ambitious, he was smart, and honestly, sometimes it's just being in the right place at the right time, right?
I guess so. But this is a guy who makes things happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
In 1352, he joins one of these Red Turban militias. And right away, everyone sees this guy. He's a natural leader. He's got this military talent that just comes out of nowhere. And by 1355, he does something super important. He captures Nanjing.
That's a big deal, right?
Oh, huge deal. Nanjing's a strategic city. And it later becomes his capital when he becomes emperor.
So this is him really starting to, consolidate power.
Exactly. He takes Nanjing, and then he starts to systematically go after all these other rebel groups, picking them off one by one. It was total power struggle, like everyone trying to be the top dog.
I bet.
What's interesting is, even while he's doing all this, he's still technically supporting the main Red Turban leader.
Really?
But then in 1367, that leader dies, maybe not totally by accident, while he's Zhu's guest, and that really clears the way for Zhu to take over.
Convenient.
It's very convenient.
So he's got Nanjing. The other rebel leaders are out of the picture. What does he do next?
Well, he goes straight for the Yuan capital.
Bold move.
Right. We're talking Dadu, which is Beijing today. And the Mongol emperor at the time, he sees the writing on the wall and just flees back to Mongolia.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, establishes what we call the Northern Yuan dynasty. But Zhu, he marches right in, takes over the palaces, and in 1368 declares himself the Hongwu emperor, and boom, the Ming dynasty is born.
The Ming Dynasty begins.
There it is.
And Ming itself, that means something, right?
Yeah, it means brightness.
Interesting.
And it's associated with the fire element in traditional Chinese cosmology. So some historians think this was a deliberate choice because the Red Turbans, they had this Manichaean background, this ancient religion that's all about light versus darkness. And the Yuan dynasty, they were associated with water, the water element. So it's like symbolically fire defeating water, a new era of brightness.
Wow, I never thought about it like that. That's pretty cool.
It's symbolic, right?
Yeah. And so the Hongwu Emperor, he rules for 30 years, and he really sets the tone for the whole dynasty.
He does. He was a strong leader, very autocratic. I mean, he really wanted to shape society, and for you living in this time, you would have felt his influence.
Yeah.
He wanted self-sufficient agricultural communities, and he really believed in corvée labor, so unpaid labor for the state, and taxes, but taxes paid in goods, not money. And this is something that's going to come up later, but he wasn't a huge fan of trade. Yeah, so he puts restrictions on it and hardly taxes it at all, which in hindsight might not have been the best move when you consider how much trade grows later on.
So he's kind of missing out on that potential revenue.
Exactly. And then there's his relationship with the literati, the educated scholar officials. He brings back the examination system, so that's how you get into government. But at the same time, he doesn't really trust them.
He's a little paranoid.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Carries out these purges to keep them in check. And he really centralizes power. Like, he abolishes the position of chancellor in 1380. So basically, he's the one calling all the shots.
No one to check his power.
Not really.
It seems like the early Ming is very inward focused,
Yeah.
Focused on internal stability and control.
You would think so, right?
Mm.
But then you have this really interesting thing. The voyages of Zheng He, these massive naval expeditions going all over the Indian Ocean. Doesn't really fit the narrative, does it?
Yeah, that doesn't sound very isolationist.
Not at all. So usually the Ming Dynasty used the tributary system to deal with other countries. Those countries would send gifts to the emperor, acknowledge him as the top dog, and in return, they could trade with China.
Makes sense.
But the Yongle emperor, he's Hongwu's successor, he decides to do things a little differently. He sends out Zheng He on these 7 voyages from 1405 to 1433. They're not going out to conquer like the Europeans were doing at the time. They're more about showing off China's power, making sure everyone knows who's boss, and solidifying those tributary relationships. They go all the way to the east coast of Africa.
That's amazing.
It is. And we still don't know for sure why they stopped these voyages so suddenly.
A real mystery.
A mystery. But it shows you that the Ming weren't always completely inward looking.
So we've got this inward focus, but also these outward bursts of power and influence. And all this time, there are still threats, right?
Oh, yeah, constantly. You still have the Mongols up north, which is why they really beef up the Great Wall during this period. Then you've got Wakut pirates causing trouble on the coasts. And then, of course, you've got the Europeans starting to show up, the Portuguese, the Spanish, later the Dutch. So the early Ming is this mix of trying to consolidate power at home while also dealing with pressure from all sides.
Sounds pretty stressful.
It was a challenging time, that's for sure. But then you get to the 16th century.
Okay.
And this is what a lot of people consider the golden age of the Ming Dynasty.
The golden age.
Yeah.
So what changes in the 16th century to make it this golden age?
Well, a lot of things, really. You see cities growing, more and more people moving into urban centers, and printing technology really takes off. So all of a sudden, you have this explosion of knowledge and ideas.
Yeah.
It's a really vibrant time.
I can imagine.
You get thinkers like Wang Yangming, who's this really independent guy challenging a lot of the traditional Confucian thinking. He's all about individual intuition and the idea that knowing something and doing something are basically the same thing.
That's a new way of thinking about it.
Yeah, very innovative for his time. And then even though the Ming weren't super into trade at first, the Europeans show up and they are really into Chinese goods, especially silk and porcelain.
I bet.
Like obsessed. And this creates a huge demand, which leads to this boom in trade. And all these craftspeople in the Yangtze River Delta are just pumping out silk and porcelain as fast as they can.
So even though the emperors were hesitant about trade, it ends up booming anyway.
Yeah, pretty much. And then you have this other huge global event that affects China. The Columbian Exchange, all of a sudden you have all these new crops coming in from the Americas, like maize and potatoes, which are great because they can grow in places where rice can't.
Yeah.
So that helps to feed the growing population. And this whole trade thing, it brings a lot of silver into China from the Americas and Japan.
Oh, interesting. So silver's becoming the thing.
It is. It starts to replace paper money, which was getting a little unreliable. And this leads to the single whip reforms, where they say, okay, everyone, all taxes now have to be paid in silver.
So a big shift to a silver-based economy.
Exactly.
Driven by all this global trade.
Yep. So you've got this golden age, everything seems to be going well, but like any story, there's a twist.
Uh-oh, what's the twist?
Well, the 17th century rolls around, and things start to go downhill.
Downhill how? Like, what's happening?
A lot of things. First, you've got the Little Ice Age hitting. This global cooling event leads to all these crop failures. People are starving, and when people are starving, they tend to get a little rebellious.
Yeah, you can't really blame them.
Exactly. And then remember all that silver that was flowing into China? Well, for various reasons, those supply lines get disrupted. And since the Ming economy was now so dependent on foreign silver, they have a major financial crisis on their hands.
Oh, that's bad.
It is, and the government is just struggling to keep things under control. And then in 1644, things really hit the fan. This rebel leader, Li Zicheng, he captures Beijing.
No way.
Yeah. And the last Ming emperor, the Chongzhen emperor, he's so desperate he commits suicide in the Forbidden City. That's the official end of the Ming Dynasty, at least in the capital.
Wow. I mean, that's a pretty dramatic end.
It is, but it's not quite over yet. Li Zicheng taking over creates this power vacuum, and the Manchus, who are getting stronger up north, they see their chance, they cross the Great Wall, they get help from this Ming general who switched sides, and they establish the Qing Dynasty.
So the Ming are out and the Qing are in.
Basically. But there were still some Ming loyalists in the south. They kept fighting for a while, hoping to restore the dynasty. They were called the Southern Ming.
So it wasn't just an immediate clean break. The Ming did try to hang on.
They did, but ultimately the king took over. So now that we've got the broad strokes of the Ming story, let's zoom in on some of the details of how their society worked and how they ran things.
Yeah, let's dive into that. Let's start with the government.
Okay, so the Ming government, very centralized, very autocratic. We talked about how the Hongwu emperor got rid of the chancellor, so all the power was in his hands. He had this huge bureaucracy to help him run things. All these officials who had to pass these super tough exams based on Confucian classics.
Yeah.
And then you had the eunuchs, who officially weren't supposed to have much power, but often did behind the scenes.
That's always the ones you least expect, right?
Exactly. Now, those exams I mentioned, they were a really big deal. They were how you got into government service, and they were brutal.
Like, how brutal are we talking?
Imagine studying for years and years, memorizing tons of Confucian texts, and then having to write these really specific essays and poems in a super strict format.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and only a tiny fraction of the people who took the exams actually passed and got good government jobs. And what's interesting is most of the people who passed came from the lower Yangtze River area. So even though the exams were supposed to be about merit, where you came from still mattered.
So there's still some regional bias going on.
There is.
It's like even in a meritocracy, who you know where you're from, it still makes a difference.
Exactly. And then when we look at how the Ming dealt with other countries, the main system was the tributary system.
Right. You mentioned that earlier. Could you remind us how that worked?
Sure. So basically, other countries would send these tribute missions to the Ming court with gifts and stuff, basically saying, hey, we recognize you're the boss. And in exchange, the Ming emperor would be like, cool, you're legit and you can trade with us.
So it's like a trade for recognition.
Pretty much. But the Ming were also pretty picky about who they considered equals.
Yeah, I bet. So how do they differentiate?
Well, they liked countries that were organized, influenced by Chinese culture and followed all the rules of the tributary system. Like Korea, they had a good relationship with Korea.
Makes sense. And what about the groups they didn't like so much?
Well, they weren't fans of the Mongols, obviously, since they had just kicked them out. And then later, they weren't too keen on the Europeans either. They called the Dutch red-haired barbarians.
Ooh, that's not very nice.
No, not really. But even though they weren't best buds, they still traded with them.
So pragmatism wins out in the end.
Right. And we talked about the Zheng He voyages. Those were a bit different. The Yongle Emperor was more into projecting power than just sticking to the tributary system.
So a bit of an exception to the rule.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the government, we've got foreign relations. Now let's talk money, economics.
Okay, so we already covered the big shift from paper money to silver, right? But that wasn't the only thing going on.
Right. So what else?
Well, since China didn't have a lot of silver itself, they had to rely on getting it from other places, mainly the Americas and Japan. So if something happened over there, it would really mess up the Ming economy.
Like a global supply chain issue, kind of?
Exactly. And then, despite not loving trade at first, the Ming actually had some pretty cool agricultural stuff going on. They brought in those new crops from the Americas, maize and potatoes, which helped them grow more food and feed all those extra people.
Smart.
Yeah. And they even had these military farming colonies, especially up north, which helped supply the army and make sure there was enough food.
So they were thinking ahead.
They were. And even though they tried to restrict it, trade just kept growing, especially in the lower Yangtze area. Places like Suzhou became these massive commercial centers just bustling with activity. And then with the single whip reforms, everyone had to pay their taxes in silver, which really cemented silver's role in the economy.
So it's like even though they had some reservations, They were still able to adapt and benefit from these economic changes.
Right, they weren't completely closed off.
Now let's talk culture and ideas. What was the intellectual scene like during the Ming Dynasty?
Well, the big thing was Neo-Confucianism, especially the ideas of this guy Zhu Xi. That was the dominant philosophy, especially if you wanted to get into government through those exams.
So it's like the official ideology.
Pretty much. But then in the 16th century, you have Wang Yangming coming along and shaking things up. He's all about individual intuition and this idea of unity of knowledge and action, meaning knowing something and doing it are basically the same thing. It was a pretty radical idea for the time.
Yeah, I could see how that would be controversial.
It was. Some people loved it, others thought it was dangerous and tried to suppress it.
So there was intellectual debate and disagreement even within this seemingly unified Confucian framework.
Absolutely. And then there's this idea of the three teachings becoming more popular: Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. People started to see them as compatible, having the same basic principles.
Kind of like a melting pot of ideas.
Yeah, exactly. But there were still some tensions between these different traditions, even though they were becoming more integrated. And then, to make things even more interesting, you have the Jesuit missionaries showing up from Europe.
Like Matteo Ricci.
Yeah, him and others, they brought all this new knowledge from the West, scientific ideas, new ways of thinking. They also tried to convert people to Christianity, but that didn't work out so well.
Right, it led to that whole rights controversy.
Exactly. So you've got all these different intellectual currents flowing during the Ming Dynasty, mixing and clashing.
Sounds like a very dynamic period intellectually.
It was. And this is also when you see the rise of vernacular literature, the stuff written in everyday language that everyone could understand.
So not just for the elite anymore.
Right. And the printing press helped spread these new forms of writing. This is when you get three of the four great classical Chinese novels: Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Water Margin, and Journey to the West.
Oh, wow. So some of the most famous Chinese literature is from this period.
It is. And then you have Jinping Mei, which is a little more scandalous, a bit more realistic, showing the dark side of society.
Sounds interesting.
It is. And in the art world, you have this shift from the traditional court painting styles to what they called literati painting. This was more about personal expression, combining calligraphy and poetry, and inspired by nature.
So a more individualistic style.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the porcelain. The Ming Dynasty is famous for its beautiful porcelain, especially the blue and white stuff from Jingdezhen. It was so popular both in China and abroad. They even started making designs specifically for the European market.
Like catering to the Dutch tulip mania.
Exactly. So they were paying attention to what people wanted.
Smart.
Yeah. And lastly, we have to talk about the military side of things.
Right, because they faced some pretty serious threats throughout their reign.
They did. The biggest threat was always the Mongols up north. So they spent a lot of time and money building and reinforcing the Great Wall. They also set up these 9 garrisons along the border to defend against attacks. But even with all that, the Mongols still managed to raid and cause trouble.
Like, it's a lot of effort to keep them out.
It was. And there was that one really embarrassing incident, the Tomb Crisis in 1449, where the Ming emperor actually got captured by the Mongols. Talk about a PR nightmare.
Wow, that must have been humiliating.
It was. But the Mongols weren't the only threat. In the end, it was the Manchus, who were growing stronger in the northeast, who finally brought the Ming Dynasty down.
So the Mongols, they fought off for centuries, but it was the Manchus who ultimately won out.
That's right. So looking back on the Ming Dynasty, it's a pretty impressive run. They went from these humble beginnings to becoming this massive, powerful empire.
Yeah, they accomplished a lot.
They did. They had a strong, centralized government, a flourishing economy, especially during that golden age in the 16th century, and they made some incredible contributions to art and literature. They were also pretty good at adapting to changes, like the shift to a silver-based economy and the influx of new crops and ideas from the West.
They weren't afraid to change with the times.
Not always, no. But like all empires, they had their weaknesses. They became too reliant on foreign silver, which made them vulnerable to economic shocks. They also struggled to control their vast territory and deal with all the different threats they faced, both internally and externally.
It's like the bigger they got, the harder it was to manage.
Exactly. And in the end, those internal and external pressures just became too much for them to handle, and the dynasty collapsed.
So it's a story of great success, but also a cautionary tale about the dangers of complacency and the importance of being able to adapt to change.
Definitely. And, when we think about the Ming Dynasty's obsession with order and their sometimes complicated relationship with the outside world, it's actually kind of relevant to what's happening in the world today.
What do you...
Well, think about it. We're living in a globalized world where countries are more interconnected than ever before. We're also facing all these new challenges like climate change, economic instability, and political conflicts. It's kind of like the Ming Dynasty, but on a global scale.
Interesting. So you're saying there are some parallels between the Ming Dynasty and our current world.
Yeah, I think so. And there are some lessons we can learn from the Ming. Like, they show us that even the most powerful empires can be vulnerable. They also show us the importance of being flexible and adapting to change. And they remind us that our relationships with other countries are crucial, and we need to find ways to cooperate and solve problems together.
So looking back at the Ming Dynasty can actually help us understand and navigate the challenges we face today.
Exactly. The Ming Dynasty is like this window into the past that can shed light on the present. It's a fascinating story, and it's full of lessons that we can apply to our own lives and to the world around us.
So for you listening, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to learn about the Ming Dynasty, its art, its culture, its politics, its people. We encourage you to do your own research, explore further, and discover for yourself the richness and complexity of this incredible period in Chinese history. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of another deep dive. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.